I never imagined I would ever write something like this. Throughout my life, I've seen myself as a man of faith ever since I entered the seminary. My mission always felt clear: to serve God, follow the sacred rituals, and guide people along the path of faith. I believed that my dedication to the church was enough to keep me on the right path, and that my life as a priest was proof of my commitment to God. But deep down, there was something I never had the courage to admit: a void. I conducted masses, heard confessions, and recited prayers flawlessly, yet something inside me always felt missing. I couldn't explain why. I simply felt it, until the day my heart stopped and my life changed forever. It was night, and I was alone in the church finishing my prayers before the altar, as I did every night. The candlelight flickered softly against the walls, casting shadows, and the silence was profound. Then, something inside me gave out. A sharp pain pierced my chest as if something was squeezing me from within. I tried to stand, but my legs collapsed and I hit the cold floor hard. Everything faded to black. What I didn't realize at that moment was that it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Somehow, I remained conscious. I opened my eyes, but what I saw made me question everything I thought was real. I was there, standing, and at the same time, lying completely still on the floor. I could see my own body lying in front of the altar. I should have been dead, but there I was. Then I felt something I'd never experienced before, an absolute peace, as if all the worries and doubts I had carried for years simply didn't exist anymore. For a moment, I just stood there, watching my own body. There was no fear or despair, only a strange sense of acceptance. I knew something extraordinary was happening, but I couldn't grasp it. It was as if I was detached from the physical world, yet more aware than ever. Time seemed irrelevant. The church around me looked the same, yet also different, sharper, more alive. The candle flames shone brighter than I had ever noticed, but the calm didn't last long. Suddenly, something shifted. The room grew cold, and an oppressive presence filled the air. Shadows began to form in the corners of the church, dark and thick, as if they were coming to life. That's when fear surged through me. These shadows weren't just the absence of light. They were something else, something alive, something watching me. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows moved toward me, and for the first time since it all began, I felt truly threatened. I had never really believed in such things. Sure, I spoke about good and evil, heaven and hell, but always in a theoretical way. But now I had no doubt. This was real, and it wanted to take me. I felt an invisible force pulling at me, as if trying to drag me to a place I couldn't see but could sense, a place of despair, an endless void. I tried to resist, but it was useless. That's when I did something I never thought I would do in a moment like that. I screamed, not with my voice because I no longer had a physical body, but with my soul. I cried out to God, and in that instant, everything changed. A brilliant light burst forth, and the shadows immediately recoiled, as if they were ashes scattered by the wind. The contrast was so intense that had I still had physical eyes, I would have closed them instinctively. But what struck me most wasn't the light itself, but what came from it. A presence. It wasn't just brightness. It was something alive, pulsating, more real than anything I had ever experienced. And then I saw him. In the center of that light stood a figure, and the moment my spiritual eyes rested on him, my heart, or whatever it was then, completely shattered. I knew without a doubt it was Jesus, not because I recognized his face from paintings or sculptures, but because his presence was unmistakable. It was as if every part of me knew he had always been there, waiting for me to truly see him. He called me by name, Gabriel. His voice wasn't like any ordinary sound. It filled everything around me and within me all at once. I expected to feel fear or shame because deep down, I knew that despite dedicating my whole life to the church, I had never truly known him. But there was no condemnation in his voice, only truth, and that truth hurt. When he looked at me, I saw my entire life flash before my eyes in a new way, as if I was finally seeing clearly. I witnessed my years in the priesthood, the sermons, the sacraments, the masses. I saw the respect of the people, the prayers I recited perfectly, but I also saw something that crushed me inside, the coldness, the distance. I witnessed moments when desperate people sought me out for something more than just pretty words, but all I offered them were empty rituals. My heart, realizing what Jesus wanted to show me, felt like I was seeing my own life through his eyes, and it was destroying me from within. I had always considered myself a man of faith, a guide for others, but there, in front of Jesus, I sensed how superficial my faith had been. It wasn't that I didn't believe, but rather that I had never truly known him. I saw myself talking about God but without feeling it, teaching about love, yet not living it fully. I followed the rituals precisely, but without understanding their essence. And worst of all, I saw the eyes of the people who had trusted me, some left empty, searching elsewhere for what I was unable to offer them. I felt the weight of that. I felt the pain of each soul seeking something real and only finding formality. My chest, or whatever part of me that was at that moment, filled with remorse. I wanted to scream, to ask for forgiveness, to undo everything, but I couldn't turn back time. I could only face the truth. I knelt down. It felt that way because I no longer had a physical body, but my soul bowed before him. I had no words, just tears, not physical tears, but something much deeper. It was then that he spoke again, and each of his words cut through me like fire, and at the same time healed. You always talked about me, but you never truly knew me. I knew it was true. I followed rules, but not my heart. That was it. I had spent my life decorating prayers, fulfilling traditions, and wearing symbols of faith, but I had never built a real relationship with him. And in that moment, a question formed within me, without me having to say anything. What do I do now? Jesus looked at me with a love I had never experienced before, and then everything around me began to change. The environment around me dissolved, as if I were being transported to another place. Suddenly, I saw scenes from my life passing before me, but not as ordinary memories. It was as if I were feeling each moment again, but with a new perspective. I saw myself celebrating masses, hearing confessions, baptizing children, but now I sensed something that had previously escaped me: the absence of a true connection. Everything felt so automatic, so mechanical. I spoke about faith, but my soul wasn't on fire with it. I explained about God, but I had never experienced his presence in a living way. And then I saw the people's faces I vaguely remembered, now becoming so clear. I saw a woman who had sought me once, crying and looking for comfort, and all I offered her were generic words and a blessing. I saw a distressed man who wanted more than tailored advice. He wanted to be heard, but I was in a rush for my next obligation and dismissed him. Now I see it clearly. I failed to love. The pain of that realization was unbearable. It was as if each of those moments pierced me like sharp blades. I thought I was serving God, but now I realized I was only serving the institution. It was as if Jesus was showing me how much I had lost by living that way. I had never allowed myself to truly feel, never opened up for God to transform me from within. And then I saw another scene. I was at the altar performing a mass, and I saw a young woman sitting in the pew, looking at me with eyes full of questions. In that instant, I perceived something I had never noticed before. She wanted more than to hear words about God. She wanted to feel God. And I had failed her too. My heart broke. If I had died right there in that moment, what would I have taken with me? Rules, traditions, embellished words. None of that would have mattered. And it was then that Jesus spoke again. "Do you want to know me?" This time I didn't hesitate. Yes, I wanted to with all that I was. I no longer wanted to live on autopilot. I wanted to be transformed. And then everything turned white. The light around me intensified until, for an instant, there were no more visions or scenes from the past, not even my own consciousness as I understood it. There was only an absolute presence, a love that filled me entirely. I had never felt anything like that. It wasn't just peace, it was something far greater. It was as if for the first time I was truly alive. All the pain, guilt, and regret I carried seemed to dissolve into his essence. I was not defined by my mistakes, but by the opportunity to be renewed. It was at that moment that I realized my entire life I had spoken about salvation, but I had never truly understood what it meant. Salvation wasn't merely about following rules or avoiding sin. It was about genuinely knowing God. It was being embraced by Him in a way that changed everything. And there, in that place beyond life, I experienced that. I don't know how long I stayed because time no longer made sense. Then something began to shift. It felt as if I was being pulled back, being called to return. I wanted to stay, to remain in that presence forever, but I knew it wasn't my time. Then I heard one last phrase before everything went dark again. "Love as I have loved you." It wasn't a command, it was an invitation, a purpose, and before I could respond, I felt as if I was falling. The light disappeared, and for a brief moment, there was complete silence. Then suddenly a sharp pain tore through my chest, and the sounds of the world rushed back with force. Voices, machines beeping, the strong smell of the hospital. I opened my eyes and saw faces above me, doctors, nurses. I was back, but I knew deep in my soul that I would never be the same. The faces around me were in shock. "He's back," I heard one nurse say, as if it were a walking miracle. My chest burned, my lungs struggled to draw breath, and my body felt heavy, as if it belonged to someone else. I didn't know how much time had passed since I collapsed on the floor of the church, but something inside told me it didn't matter. What mattered was what I had experienced, or rather, what I had learned. As the doctors hurried to check my vital signs, I just stared at the white ceiling of the hospital, tears streaming down my face, unable to hold them back. No one there could understand what had happened to me. To them, I was just a man who nearly died, and for some unexplainable reason, came back. But I knew the truth. I had been called back. I had been given a second chance, and I couldn't waste it. In the days that followed, as I recovered, I reflected on everything I had seen and felt. Every scene, every word, every look from Jesus stayed alive within me, like an indelible mark. How could I simply return to my routine? How could I continue being the same priest, following the same rituals, without letting this truth change me? The answer was clear. I couldn't. Something inside me had been broken, and in that emptiness, a new fire had been kindled. But how could I talk about it with others? How could I explain what I had experienced without sounding crazy? Would they listen? Would they believe me? I knew many would try to rationalize it, saying it was just delirium, a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen to the brain, but I had no doubts. I saw Jesus, I heard him, I knew him, and now I had to help others know him too. When I finally returned, the church looked the same, but I was no longer the same. The altar was in its usual place, the pews lined up as always, the candles lit as if nothing had happened. But looking at that space, I felt a different weight. It was as if I were seeing everything for the first time. I walked to the altar and touched the cold wood, recalling the moment my body collapsed there. It was there that I ceased to exist for a time. It was there I found the one I claimed to serve, but had never truly known. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I needed to speak. I needed to share. But were they ready to listen? Was I ready to face whatever would come next? I knew this journey wouldn't be easy. In the first sermon I gave after my recovery, I quickly realized something was different. I opened the Bible, but this time not just to mechanically read a well-decorated passage. I wanted those words to come alive. I looked at the people before me and saw the same familiar faces, but this time I saw deeper. I saw their pain, their doubts, their unspoken questions. They were coming to the church seeking something that, until then, I had never truly offered them. And that day, for the first time, I spoke from the heart, not about rules or doctrines, but about Jesus, about a living, real God who wanted not just obedience, but relationship. Some faces lit up with curiosity, while others tensed with discomfort. I knew not everyone would accept this change, but I could no longer go back. I had not only returned to life, I had been reborn. The transformation within me began to overflow into the way I lived. The priesthood could no longer perform rituals automatically. Every mass, every confession, and every conversation with a parishioner took on new meaning. I stopped just listening to sins and began to listen to the people. I stopped merely preaching doctrines and started speaking about the real love of Christ. At first, many didn't know how to react. Some people in my parish began to notice the change and came to ask what had happened. Some wanted to understand, others just watched from a distance, trying to decide whether it was a blessing or madness. What surprised me the most was the resistance coming from within the church itself. My fellow priests began to look at me with suspicion. "Father Gabriel, you're different," some said. Others were more direct. "This isn't what we were taught. You're straying from tradition." But how could I go back to who I was before? How could I pretend I hadn't seen Jesus with my own eyes? How could I ignore the words he spoke to me? I knew my path wouldn't be easy. Some people distanced themselves, upset by my change. Others came to me out of curiosity, trying to understand what had happened. But what kept me going was seeing those who were finally discovering something they had never felt before. People who came to church out of obligation were now coming because they wanted to know God. People who had only repeated prayers were now speaking to Jesus as if he were right there, because he was. What had once been a cold building of rituals transformed into a home for souls thirsty for something real, and I was no longer just a priest. I was a man who had finally found the God he had sought his entire life. As the months passed, I realized my new way of living faith wasn't welcomed by everyone. Some people, especially the more traditional ones, began to question my change. "Isn't this heresy?" I heard from a man who always sat in the front row at Mass. Others whispered that I was straying. I myself, before all this, would have thought the same way, but it wasn't confusion. I had never felt so clear-headed in my life. For the first time, I understood what it truly meant to follow Jesus. It wasn't just about following rules or maintaining a religious structure. It was about knowing God as someone alive, real and present. It was about loving people the way he loved me. And despite all the resistance, I couldn't deny this truth. But it wasn't easy. The suspicious glances soon turned into outright reprimands. Some of the other parents began to avoid me. One of them, a longtime friend, approached me with concern in his eyes. "Gabriel, you need to be careful. You're going too far," he said seriously. I knew he spoke out of jealousy, but my response was sincere. How can I ignore what I experienced? How can I continue serving God the same way after having been in his presence? He didn't know how to respond. He just sighed and shook his head. "Just be careful," he repeated before walking away. That conversation made me realize something important. Following the truth sometimes means walking alone. But I didn't feel afraid. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the right path and was ready to face whatever was necessary to stay on it. Days turned into months, and my new focus began to attract people who had never felt comfortable in church before. People who always considered themselves unworthy, who thought religion was just a burden of rules and punishments. They started to come to me. I spoke with them, listened to their stories, and for the first time understood the depth of the human need for something real, not just symbolic. I saw tears in eyes that had been dry from hiding pain for so long. I saw hardened hearts beginning to open as they realized God was not a distant figure, but a Father who loved them just as they were. And all of this was happening because I was finally learning to love as He loved me. But at the same time, the resistance against me was growing. I received a call from the bishop of my diocese, asking me to explain what was going on. He welcomed me with a serious, formal expression. "Father Gabriel, I have received troubling reports about how you have been leading your parish. Some say you are straying from the church's traditional teachings." I took a deep breath before answering. "Your Excellency, I am not rejecting tradition, but trying to show people that faith is more than tradition. It's about knowing Jesus. He is real. He is alive." The bishop studied me for a moment, and I could see in his eyes a mix of concern and skepticism. "Be careful, Father Gabriel. Many people have already gotten lost trying to interpret God in their own way." I knew it would be useless to argue further. I simply nodded and accepted his words respectfully. But inside, I knew I wasn't interpreting God in my own way. I had simply found Him. Finally, after that conversation with the bishop, I realized I was being watched closely. Every word I spoke in my sermons was now being analyzed. Any change in how I conducted the church meetings sparked rumors. Some parents began to avoid me entirely, while others subtly tried to steer me back to the right path. But I knew there was no turning back. I couldn't erase the truth I had experienced. Faith, for me, would never again be just a system of rules. It would never again be a mechanical obligation. I had been in His presence, I had felt His love and nearness like never before, and I had received a clear calling to love as He loved me. I was not going to give up on that, even if it meant facing opposition from all sides. The people in the parish began to change. Some left upset by my more direct and emotional approach to faith. Others, however, stayed, and not only stayed, but thrived. For the first time, I saw real transformation. People who once attended Mass as mere spectators were now genuinely seeking God. They wanted more than just rituals. They wanted to understand, feel, and live their faith. I witnessed miracles, not grand signs, but hearts opening and lives being restored. "Love as I have loved you," were Jesus' words before I returned to my body. And that was exactly what I was trying to do. But the question was, how long would they let me continue? It wasn't long before my change began to bring more serious consequences. One day, I was called again by the bishop, but this time the tone was no longer just one of concern. It was a warning. "Father Gabriel, your conduct has caused divisions within the church. Many of the faithful are confused. Some say you're driving people away from tradition. You need to be careful," he said, his tone firm. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that conversation. "Excellency, I'm not pushing anyone away. I'm trying to bring them closer to Jesus. People come to me not because they want to escape tradition, but because they want something real, something that transforms their lives. I'm just teaching what He showed me." The bishop studied me for a few moments before responding, "That may cost you dearly, Father. I hope you know what you're doing." Those words echoed inside me for a long time. I knew what I was doing. I knew I was on the right path, but I also knew I was walking on dangerous ground. Then the news I feared arrived. A few days later, I received formal notice from the diocese informing me that I would be transferred to a smaller parish far from the city to reflect on my path. Deep down, I knew what that meant. It was a transfer disguised as a punishment. They wanted to silence me. They wanted to take me out of the spotlight before my message caused more upheaval. For a moment, I felt a knot in my chest. What was I supposed to do now? Accept it and disappear, or fight back? But then I remembered Jesus' presence, what he told me, the love I had felt. No matter where I was, my mission didn't change. I wouldn't turn back the day I packed my bags. I felt a mix of sadness and peace. I knew I was being transferred, but I also knew none of that changed what I had lived through. Some people came to say goodbye, others avoided looking at me, as if my presence had become uncomfortable. One of the deacons I had worked with for years shook my hand sincerely and quietly said, "I know what you experienced was real, but not everyone is ready for that." His words strengthened me. I wasn't alone. I would never be alone again, because now I knew Jesus was with me, not just as an idea, but as a living, present reality. My new parish was small, isolated, almost forgotten by the diocese, a place where no one paid attention. But soon I realized that didn't matter. What mattered were the people who were there. I saw in their eyes the same thirst I had seen in my old church. I saw people attending Mass out of habit, but without hope, without transformation. And so I started again, little by little, quietly, without drawing attention, simply living as Jesus called me to, speaking about him as someone who truly knew him, living my faith as a relationship, not a ritual. And then the unexpected happened. People began to change. The fire of genuine faith started to spread. Not because I wanted to reform the church, but because I wanted people to meet the Christ I knew. It didn't matter where I was. My mission had never been about a place. It was always about him. Months passed and something incredible began to take shape. That small parish, forgotten by the diocese, started filling up. People from neighboring towns showed up, bringing friends, family, and curious visitors. It wasn't because I was doing anything extraordinary. I was simply talking about Jesus the way I knew him, real, alive, and present. People wanted more than doctrine. They wanted to genuinely encounter God, and he was revealing himself. I saw hardened hearts soften. I saw tears from people who had never allowed themselves to feel before. I saw those who had given up on faith come back, because for the first time, they sensed this wasn't just a system, but a true encounter with Christ. And I was simply doing what he asked of me, loving as he loved me. But it wasn't all easy. I knew the diocese was watching, even from a distance. I knew my presence there was a nuisance to some. I received subtle warnings, suggestions to uphold tradition, hints not to promote some strange movement. But I wasn't promoting anything. I was just living what I saw, what I felt, what had transformed me. Some nights I would kneel alone inside the church and ask God, "How much longer can I keep going?" And in the silence, I sensed a reply, not in words, but in peace. I didn't need to know how long, I just needed to keep going. Over time, my story began to spread beyond the walls of that little parish. Some people came from far away, not because they wanted a different sermon, but because they wanted to understand what had happened to me. "Father, what did you see?" Sabrina would sometimes ask. I never quite knew how to answer, how to explain with words something that can only be understood in the spirit. But I tried. I told the truth, without embellishment, without exaggeration. I saw Jesus. He showed me that I had spent my life talking to him without truly knowing him, and now I just want to do things differently. Some people were excited, others felt uneasy, and some simply didn't know what to say. But one thing was certain, no one left indifferent. Something inside them shifted, even if it was just a seed of doubt planted in their hearts. Then came the decision I was expecting. A formal notice from the diocese informing me that my position at that parish would be reconsidered. The explanation was vague, but I understood what was happening. I was causing a stir. I was touching on something many preferred to leave undisturbed. They didn't know how to handle me. I wasn't a rebel. I wasn't opposing the church. I was just trying to live according to what Christ showed me. For some, that was too much. I knew my time there was running out, but that didn't scare me because I finally understood. It wasn't about where I was or which church accepted me or not. It was about whom I served. As long as there was someone willing to listen, I would speak. The night before I received my final response from the diocese, I knelt before the altar of the small church, just as I had done many times before. But this time I wasn't praying for answers. I already knew they didn't matter. What mattered was continuing to follow the calling Jesus had given me, no matter where it led. I closed my eyes and fell silent, simply feeling. And then something happened that made me shiver. It wasn't a vision or a loud voice from heaven. It was a presence, a deep certainty within me. He was there. I couldn't see him, but I felt him as real as the day I found him in the light. And in that moment, all doubt vanished. I knew I didn't need a title, an altar, or a position within the church to carry on my mission. All I needed was to follow the voice that called me that night, between life and death. The next morning, the news came. I would be removed indefinitely. The official reason was that I needed time to reflect and rest spiritually. I knew what that really meant. It wasn't a break, it was exile. But I didn't feel anger or fear, only a strange peace. I knew that in some way my journey within the church's structure had come to an end. But my faith, my mission, my purpose, those were just beginning. I gathered my few belongings and walked out the church door without looking back. I didn't know exactly where I would go or what I would do next, but I knew that wherever I was, I would carry with me the one truth I truly knew: Jesus. And now, all I wanted was to help others know him too. If this story touched you in any way, pause and think, what if it were you? What would you do if you had a real encounter with Jesus? Would you keep living as before, or would everything change? I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and share your experience or reflection on this video. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new transformative content like this. Your interaction makes all the difference in helping more people access these messages.